seen that before, actually. Very few. There's a couple things I'd like to point out before we discuss it a little bit. One is how, so much of today has been about how you can be an immediate cause of change in our own kind of immediate worlds. And, a few things that strike me about watching that speech. One kind of ties back to what Dr. Duvall was talking about earlier, and that is, in this speech, RFK is incredibly comfortable making himself vulnerable. That rather than putting himself in a position where he's preaching to people and talking down to them and distancing himself from their pain, which is very justifiable, he opens himself up. Right? That if we've talked so much today about the need to take peaceful action, the first thing has to do to be willing in a way to kind of open up our hearts in the same sense. That, Dr. Duvall talked about how often we feel a need to kind of maintain a certain level of masculinity, for instance. And how what you have here is he's talking about, which he rarely did in public, talking about the pain he experienced when his own brother had been shot. He even does maybe the most unmasculine thing of all, which is he starts quoting poetry, right? And yet it's a way to really bond with the audience at that moment. I think it's a very striking decision on his part. A few other things I wanted to mention as well. One is that I always try to impress this on my students when we're reading stories that especially are centered in worlds with which they're not comfortable, is that he takes the pain of the people he's addressing very seriously. Right? There's no worse thing we can do when we're having a dialogue with the other side than to make them feel that their pain isn't justified. But I did kind of want to get some responses. Are there some components that struck you about obviously this very short kind of impromptu speech that made him successful in a 4.5-minute window from moving the crowd to a desire to kind of perform violence to a desire to actually kind of come together and kind of commune? Was there anything that jumped out at you? Yeah, go ahead.
He did a good job at creating a balance in his speech. When he said, when he was talking about what blacks could do for their anger, and I listen to Dr. Cornel West a lot. And he says you don't want to ignite black rage, and you don't want to ignore black rage. And he did a good job at making sure that everybody knew that. Like he made it, gave a good exposure.
That's a really good point. It's funny you mentioned Cornel West. Cornel West talks a lot in both his writings and his speeches about how there's two types of peace. There's the peace that is a denial of conflict. And that's the most dangerous form of peace in a sense, because basically you're not really meeting head-on or addressing these kinds of conflicts. You just don't want to deal with the difficulties of addressing them. And West talks conversely about the kind of peace we hope to strive for, and I think he refers to us as a democratic experiment, is the active, dynamic peace, where you're right, it's very clear that in the speech, Kennedy's very comfortable acknowledging rage in a way, and saying it's a justified feeling, but also attempting to map out that if we choose to collectively to take that particular path, it only begets more violence and destruction, and we find ourselves feeling as this crowd does more and more often. So no, I think that's a really important point. That I think again to go back to my initial point, it's part of how one differentiates a really effective, successful public speech to one that is clearly manipulation. That all speeches, most political speeches, for instance, are inherently optimistic. But some are optimistic because they choose to deny reality. And some like this are optimistic because they choose to meet reality head on and see how we as a group or as a community can kind of collectively move forward. So that's a really good point. That's a really good point. Were there some other things that struck any of you that you wanted to mention? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, that's a really good point. It's something that we've been discussing actually in my class a lot lately, which is that one of the dangerous aspects when you're leading discussions on fiction or stories or nonfiction speeches is that you don't want to have your students, and you don't want to as a listener, ignore difference. It's too simple just to say, well, we're all the same, because that's not really doing justice to our backgrounds in a sense. That there are a lot of things that do actually make us different. We all have unique experiences that have brought us to where we are. And so Kennedy does an excellent job of articulating, okay, you know, I can't entirely identify with some of what you're feeling. You know, I haven't come from the same background. The color of my skin is not the same, and yet he does find some kind of point of universal connection, which is to say, he says, for instance, you know, I can't maybe understand what it's like to be black, but I can understand what it's like to lose a family member to violence, right? And I think that's a really key thing. That again, it speaks back to this issue that you brought up of an active peace, which is in a passive peace, we ignore our differences. And by ignoring our differences, we're never able to come to any type of larger understanding or connection. It's only in addressing those differences, the real differences we have, and yet finding out some kind of common stake in things, where we can really productively, proactively move forward. I mean, I think he does it very well. I mean, I'm really struck by, you know, it's not a speech that he'd had scripted. His advisors had told him not to stand up that night and talk at all. And yet, in such a short amount of time, you see you hear the community, unprovoked, start to really kind of rally behind him, you know, in a deeply beautiful way. Was there anything else that jumped out at anyone that they wanted to mention? Yeah, go ahead. Yes. That's very good. You know, it's an excellent point you make. I mean, I think about this a lot. My father used to have this joke where he'd say, you know, there's no quicker way to disrespect someone than to tell them they're crazy, or to tell them when they tell you what their feelings are to just say, well, you're being ridiculous, or you just need to move past them, right? In some respects, it's a terribly selfish act, and so in some respects, it is very striking that a large part of the speech is really about giving individuals an opportunity to experience their pain, but to try and take from their pain something that's productive as opposed to destructive, right? Now, I mean, I want us to think about or kind of bracket all these things that we've mentioned and discussed as we move into the James Brown piece. The James Brown piece is interesting because he's doing a lot of the same things Kennedy is doing, and yet he's finding himself in an even more violent, large-scale situation. And so it'll be kind of interesting to see not only what he's doing that's similar to RFK, but how he's also using some other kind of crowd control techniques or conflict resolution techniques that really stave off an impending disastrous riot. Okay, so we'll watch this and then we'll continue to discuss.